The president wants deals, but he only wants good deals. Whenever you present a deal to the president, the question is, am I better off with just having the tariff?
Hello, and welcome to The Conversation. I'm Dasha Burns, Politico's White House bureau chief, and every week on this show, I invite one of the most compelling and sometimes unexpected power players in Washington and beyond in for a chat to find out how they're navigating and shaping this incredible era of American politics. Tariffs have become the top tool for President Trump. He believes that resetting our trade relationships is key to America's economic prosperity, but he also sees tariffs as leverage for foreign policy, for peace deals, and much more. And that's why I've been so eager to sit down with my first guest this week, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. He is the key player on Trump's trade agenda. He's a former trade lawyer and actually served as chief of staff to Robert Lighthizer, who was the last guy to hold this job in Trump's first term. Greer breaks down the strategy for dismantling 70 years of trade policy, one deal at a time. Jamieson Greer joins the conversation. Jamieson Greer, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
You have probably the most important portfolio of this administration, given just how big of a priority trade has been for the president. I was at many a Trump rally when he talked about how tariff is his favorite word, now his fifth favorite word, right. God, love, wife, something else
he
about
had
that.
to moderate a little bit on that, yeah.
But you are a veteran trade lawyer. You served in Trump's first term as chief of staff to Ambassador Lighthizer. What is different about the approach this time around?
Well, first of all, in the first Trump administration, we were charting new waters, right? We were coming into a so-called Washington consensus that tariffs were bad and we shouldn't protect domestic industry and we shouldn't try to make tough deals with our friends and foe alike. Now, having laid the groundwork in the first term, showing we could use tariffs effectively while having a booming economy, the president was able to move to his true vision, which he's had for many years, which is to protect the American economy with tariffs, use them as leverage where needed to get foreign market access, and otherwise use them for geopolitical issues. So where we were walking in the first term, now we can run and fly, frankly.
When you were stepping into this role, how much did you fully realize just how massive the trade and tariff agenda was going to be for this administration?
Well, I assisted during transition with policy, and in between the two terms, I was quite active defending the president's trade policy, testifying before Congress about what appropriate trade policy should look like, and that kind of thing. And the president very clearly campaigned on having a global tariff of around 10% and having higher tariffs on countries that were bigger offenders or trade cheats like China or others. And so I always knew that was the plan, that we'd have a global tariff and then higher tariffs. But I think it's gone farther beyond that in terms of scale and scope. One thing I didn't envision was actually making a ton of deals where we get to keep the tariffs and get foreign market access to have other countries take their tariffs down. That has been something that's a huge benefit to U.S. exporters. It's a great way to get the U.S. deficit down, and it just shows the foresight of the president in how he can use tariffs.
One of the narratives around the tariff strategy is that the strategy is chaos, right? This has been really unpredictable. One day it's 150%, one day it's 10%. Nobody really knows where this is going to go. I've heard from businesses that it's been a challenge because they're just not sure where all of this is going to land. Plus, then you have all of the legal cases on top of that. So is the strategy chaos? Is there a strategy? Like, what are you guys doing?
So yes, there's a strategy. First of all, you don't change 70 years of trade policy overnight. And second of all, when some people say, oh, well, this is chaos, what's your strategy? What they really want to know is, can we go back to how it was before? And that's not going to happen. I would say if you look at, and a lot of people focus on April 2nd, right? Liberation Day, we announced potentially very, very high tariffs. But I would focus people more on August 1st. And I use that date because that is the date where the president really set the tariff rates, right? And where we announced a bunch of deals. And from there, the structure that is played out demonstrates the strategy that we have. And here's the strategy in short. If you look at the tariff setup in the world that's come out of the president's program, the highest tariffs are on China. Again, not because we bear China any ill will, but because we have a giant trade deficit with them and they have a lot of unfair trading practices. The next set of highest tariffs is Southeast Asia, India, these other areas that use a lot of Chinese content, Southeast Asia in particular, and we have giant trade deficits with them, Vietnam, for example. And then the next highest tariff rates, and these are usually about 15, folks who are allies but with whom we have big trade issues, Korea, Japan, Europe, etc. And then the lowest tariff rates are really in the Western Hemisphere, where we want our supply chains to be, where it's very secure. You can really see almost like concentric rings going out from China what the tariff rates are like. We have a couple outliers right now. India has a higher tariff for some geopolitical reasons. They buy Russian oil. Brazil has some higher
we were close to a
tariffs.
deal there over the summer, and it got derailed. What happened there?
The president wants deals, but he only wants good deals, right? And so whenever you present a deal to the president, the question is, am I better off with just having the tariff? And the assessment of the deal in the summer with India was, well, I think we're just better off with the tariff than with a potential deal. But that has not stopped us from continuing conversations. It's still going quite well, I would say, with the Indians. There's a separate issue where they were buying Russian oil. They've stopped doing that largely now. So I think we could see some tariff modification at some point for them. I'm confident that we'll get a deal with India at some point in the future, maybe the near future. It'll be up to the president and Prime Minister Modi.
And have you been involved at all in talking about a potential future trading partnership with Russia after the end of the war?
Not very much, right? Even before the war, we didn't have a huge trading relationship with Russia, right? We would get oil and steel and some fertilizer from them. We'd ship them cars and some ag products. So it was never a giant trading relationship. If the war ends, then obviously there may be opportunity there, but we're really focused on big export markets.
There's been a ton of debate about the short, medium, and long-term impact of these tariffs. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development just released a report saying the world economy has been surprisingly resilient in the face of Trump's trade wars, but they added that they expect higher tariffs to gradually result in higher prices and reduced growth in household consumption and business investment. How do you respond to that assessment? And are you worried about some economic pain in the short term?
I just look at the data, right? I mean, they are projecting something, right? They're saying, we think it'll lead to lower growth in the future or higher prices or something. But they've been saying that for a long time. And what we have now are data. And the data show that last quarter was 3.8% growth. Atlanta Fed is projecting 4.2% growth next year. We've seen inflation in check. We've seen imported goods remain relatively low priced. Where we see prices high are things like housing and healthcare, because Obamacare is a disaster. And if you go back to the first term, right, when the president put many tariffs on China, it was the first large use of tariffs in decades. Inflation actually went down during that time. Tariffs are not necessarily inflationary at all. I hear about projections, and people can project whatever they want. I just look at data of what's actually happening, and we haven't seen any of that. We've actually seen growth. We've seen blue-collar wages go up. We've seen jobs go up.
One thing that could derail all of this is the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court is weighing whether to narrow the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which is the 1970s era law that the admin has cited for imposing many of these tariffs. How are you guys preparing for the possibility that one of these main tariff authorities you've been using could be constrained?
Well, so first of all, we believe the law and the facts are on our side. Just out the gate. The Supreme Court has talked about how important it is to simply analyze the plain text of the law. If you look at the plain text, it says the president, if he determines there's an emergency, he can regulate imports. And he's determined there's an emergency, and he's regulating imports, which is the tariff. It's how it's always been used. It's how that language has always been interpreted. So on the text of the matter, we have a very strong case. Now, we've been thinking about this plan for 5 years or longer, right,
Yeah.
since the first term. So you can be sure that when we came to the president at the beginning of the term, we had a lot of different options. IEPA is the most appropriate because there is an emergency with the trade deficit and the loss of manufacturing, and it has the flexibility that you need to respond to the type of emergency that there is. My message is tariffs are going to be a part of the policy landscape going forward. You know, are there other ways to do it? Courts during this process has actually cited to those different tools. And while we certainly can use those, IEPA is the best tool. It fits the situation, and we're looking forward to hearing back from the Supreme Court soon.
But you're prepared for alternative measures if they do decide to constrain IEPA?
Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, or else I'll get in trouble with my general counsel.
You got some back pocket.
Of course.
Okay. All right. Regardless of how the Supreme Court rules on this, the administration's reciprocal tariffs could be reversed by a future president, right? Is there any plan to go to Congress to try to codify any of this stuff?
Well, if I were Congress, I would codify it, right? I have heard from a handful of members of Congress from all over the ideological spectrum, whether left or right or progressive or conservative, free trader or protectionist, however you want to characterize it. I've heard a lot of interest in this, and for a lot of reasons. One, people have seen what I just described, which is that you can implement tariffs and have growth at the same time. You can protect your supply chains and have wages increase. You can do all of these things together, especially if you couple it with good energy policy, et cetera. I've also had members of Congress come to me, people who maybe weren't fans of tariffs 2 years ago, and they said, this is actually real money that's coming in that can be used to pay down the debt or pay for other things or finance our reindustrialization.
Who are those members?
Well, I won't betray their confidences, right?
Gotta try.
But I will say they are folks who, normally would say, Jamieson, why are we doing tariffs, right? They're people who are saying, I look at what you're doing, I see the president's vision, and this is really helpful, and maybe we should make these a legacy item for the president. So there are certainly people on the Hill talking about that possibility.
There's a lot of push and pull with who has the power to do what? Executive branch, legislative branch, judicial. What, in your view, is the appropriate role of Congress versus the executive branch in shaping long-term trade strategy and improving big trade measures?
Well, so the Constitution, it assigns power to do tariffs to Congress. It assigns foreign policy power to the president. And Congress, frankly, in its wisdom over decades, delegated an enormous amount of the tariff authority to the president in a lot of different ways. IEPA is one, but we have a variety of different tools. Section 301, Section 232, like these are just kind of numbers, legal provisions. But there are different reasons why Congress wanted the president to act, because the president can act with agility, the president can be flexible, the president can negotiate. These are things where Congress is not, institutionally, they're not apt for it, right? But they maintain oversight. Even with IEPA, if they don't like what the president's doing under IEPA, they can vote it down, right? And we had some members who tried to do that, and they failed. So Congress, certainly, they set out their kind of priorities that they have, and they can delegate the authority. My office, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, was actually created by Congress in the 60s because they felt like the president needed an office in the White House to direct trade policy. That's how strongly they felt about it. So there's certainly a role for the executive.
You said that some members are telling you, hey, I've changed my mind on tariffs. There are other members that have spoken privately, on background, publicly, saying, these tariffs are hurting my constituents, particularly people in farm states. I'm thinking Grassley, I'm thinking Rand Paul, I'm thinking a number of folks that have come out and said they're concerned. What do you say to members of Congress who feel that this is not beneficial for their folks?
Well, Senator Paul is a little bit of a man on an island on this issue.
Well, sure, but Don Bacon...
He compared me to a Soviet commissar in some comments, like...
All right, well, we'll leave Rand Paul on the side here, but there are others, Bacon and Grassley and other folks that have voiced some concerns.
I would say I've talked to Senator Grassley a lot. He knows a lot about trade. He's been around a long time, and he clearly, as a general matter, it sounds to me frequently that he is quite aligned with the president in terms of wanting to get foreign market access, particularly for his folks who are trying to sell pork and soybeans overseas. We have made sure, in addition to securing soybean purchases from China, who's a big customer, to open markets in Southeast Asia in particular for soybeans, markets that were never open before. Now these countries are taking down their tariff, they're taking down their non-tariff barriers. And so on that, I think we're aligned. There's always concern when you're changing what's a 70-year trade policy to something new, and there can be frictions, but we are careful to listen to these folks, again, from both sides of the aisle, find out what their concerns are and respond to them.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm getting at. I mean, what you guys are doing is sort of a major reset, right? And you're juggling a lot of different interests. You've got manufacturers, farmers, service sector workers, consumers. How do you prioritize and navigate those?
I mean, so first of all, the politics of trade are really interesting, and they're quite parochial, right? It's not a kind of right-left or Republican-Democrat issue, right? A lot of it depends on what your economy is like, where your district is, urban versus rural, et cetera. For a long time, in the politics of trades, the farmers and the agricultural community were often pitted against the manufacturers. And U.S. policy for a long time was, let's trade off access to the U.S. market in manufacturing to get a little bit of foreign market access for our agricultural producers overseas. So we entered into this situation where maybe we could sell a few more soybeans in China, but now all of a sudden we're importing all of our technology and heavy equipment from China.
The trade-offs.
Exactly. And it shouldn't have to be that way. We shouldn't have farmers and manufacturers pitted against each other. We should be working together. And that's what we've done this term. So like our agreement with Malaysia, for example. Malaysia has agreed that we can keep a 19% tariff on Malaysia for most goods. At the same time, they've agreed to lower their tariffs on most goods for us. And so we're able to protect our manufacturers but also have new market access for our agricultural producers. It's really a flipping of the script. I think the more people realize how significant a change it is in trade policy, the more they'll appreciate how we've modified the politics of trade.
On the consumer side, though, the president did exempt some agricultural imports from tariffs amid ongoing concerns about higher prices. Why didn't he do that from the beginning, or how did that shift come about?
So first of all, inflation's been in check. So let's just clear the air on that. Secondly, in early September, the president signaled, he put out an executive order, and we made a list of all the, whether it's agricultural goods or minerals or things like that, that physically can't be grown in the United States or extracted from the United States, right? The rocks aren't here, or you can't grow a banana here, right, in any scale. So in early September, he put out an executive order. He said, as I do deals with countries, I will release tariffs on these items. Why? Because we get them from those countries. I mean, Ecuador is a good example. We announced a framework agreement last week with Ecuador, or the week before. What do we get from Ecuador? We get coffee, cocoa, bananas, things like that. So when the president said 2 months from now, I'm going to release these tariffs, he did that. He did it in connection with a bunch of deals. It just makes sense, right? We can use these tariffs for leverage, which the president did. We have the deals with them, so now we don't have to have a tariff on them.
Yeah, so I'm not an economist, and I'm not here to say whether tariffs are good or bad, but I am trying to understand. There seems to be a real resistance in the language around tariffs to say that tariffs are causing higher prices. Nobody wants to really say that. But in making the exemptions, aren't you kind of basically acknowledging that tariffs do lead to higher prices on products?
No.
Okay.
No,
Can you explain?
Yeah. So first of all, there's never really a one-to-one with a tariff. Again, I'll cite back to my example I gave you from the first term. When we put tariffs on China, inflation actually went down. As we were putting tariffs in place, inflation went down. We've seen a similar effect here. When the president says, we're going to have deals with you folks, you have to have leverage, right? And so you keep tariffs on folks for all kinds of things, and it becomes a carrot, right? So it's a lot easier for me to go to Ecuador or Indonesia or Vietnam and say, listen, if you do a deal with us, and we've announced frameworks or full agreements with all these countries I just mentioned, then at a given time, we will release these things, because obviously we don't make them, right? The issue is when you have a tariff, it doesn't necessarily go through to the consumer. I don't want to get too technical here for you,
Right.
Except I'm kind of nerdy about it.
But sometimes does it?
So, I mean, it can, right? I mean, and
On those things that you mentioned, like coffee and bananas and all of that.
it depends on what the production economy is like. And when I say production economy, say bananas, if you have 100 banana producers overseas, they're all going to compete for market share in the U.S. because we're the biggest consumer of a lot of these things. And so they will compete to eat the tariff, right? Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. But when voters who don't understand this are going to the grocery store and seeing that prices haven't gone down, how do you tackle that with all the leverage that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I can't control the weather in Brazil with a tariff, right? So coffee prices, for example, have been going up for 2 years before there was ever a tariff on coffee for 6 months or whatever we had. So I can't control the weather with the tariff. And there are secular pricing trends in coffee and cocoa that were going on well before, and beef, these kinds of things. All that being said, right, we don't have to have a tariff on these things. We don't make them here. We can have a tariff on them for leverage, which is how the president used them. It's how he said he was going to use it. He signaled in September, these are for leverage to finish the deals. So we were well placed 2 months later, once we announced the rest of our deals, to take the tariffs off, because we don't have to have a tariff on those things.
There's a lot that you're using these tariffs for leverage, for reducing the trade deficits. One thing that the president wants to do is reshoring manufacturing and bringing jobs back. I don't think I have to tell you that technological advancement, automation, AI, and frankly, just the 2 decades plus of globalization make that a really big challenge. How realistic do you think is a broad manufacturing revival, and what kinds of jobs or industries are most promising under that strategy?
It is challenging. You're entirely correct. The global average of manufacturing as a share of GDP is about 16%. And so in countries like Germany and Japan, it's higher than 16%. In the United States, it's 11%. And so my hope and our goal is that 11% can start trending upward to 16%. We want manufacturing to be a larger part of our GDP, because that signifies, more jobs, et cetera. In terms of what kind of jobs would you look for? It's all kinds, right? I mean, we naturally think about advanced manufacturing, automotive, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, And we have examples of new investments in all of these sectors. Product lines coming back from overseas. GE is doing more appliances here. Stellantis is moving an auto production line from Canada back to the United States. Pharmaceutical companies like Novartis and Roche are like building new facilities in the United States. So there's a lot of that. But we also need the basic manufacturing, right? Or the foundational manufacturing, steel, aluminum, fertilizer. These are things that are really important, not only for economic security, but national security. If we're expected to kind of be an arsenal of democracy or protect ourselves and maybe our allies, we have to be able to have robust supply chains. And that means the advanced manufacturing, the foundational manufacturing, and everything in between.
I do want to talk about some specific agreements, particularly the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, that Trump negotiated in his first term, is facing a mandatory review next year. What are the top changes that the administration is looking to make?
So when you think about U.S., Canada, and Mexico, there are a few things we trade among us in a massive way. One of them is automobiles, another's agriculture, another is energy. With respect to the auto trade, the goal is to make more autos in the United States of America. Mexico has been a huge beneficiary of NAFTA and then of USMCA. And so the president, earlier in his second term, he imposed tariffs on autos globally, including on Mexico. And so there's an overlap between those tariffs and our agreement in USMCA. And so those tariffs, which are about 25%, are layered over USMCA. Now, all of that being said, we can look at the underlying rules of USMCA. If something comes in and gets special duty treatment or a lower tariff, there's usually a rule of origin associated with it that says you have to make a certain amount of this widget has to come from the region. Otherwise, you have to pay a higher tariff. We can change some of those rules to make them tighter, to have a higher percentage have to come from the United States. Those are the kinds of things we can do. There's also a bunch of stuff in Mexico and Canada where maybe they discriminate against our companies. It could be telecom companies, or it could be our corn exports. There are a variety of little things like that that may seem small and don't lend themselves to sound bites, but they mean a lot for agricultural producers.
Is there still a scenario where the U.S. could walk away from USMCA, or is that off the table at this point?
I mean, that's always a scenario, right? The president's view is he only wants deals that are a good deal. The reason why we built a review period into USMCA was in case we needed to revise it, review it, or exit it. I have heard from a lot of folks how important USMCA is. Canada and Mexico are huge export markets for us.
I remember I was covering voters across Ohio and the Rust Belt talking about this when he was first negotiating USMCA, and there were a ton of folks in those areas that were so supportive of this deal.
That's right. And I mean, a lot of it was because we made new rules that were designed to produce more autos in America. The president now has his Section 232 kind of layered on top of USMCA, which further incentivizes it. But I think if we make the rules even more robust to make sure that third countries aren't beneficiaries of the deal, that any deal is really between the U.S. and its neighbors, that's something that's possible. But I mean, the president, I talked to him about it yesterday. I was in the White House yesterday, and we were talking about USMCA. What about Mexico? What about Canada? The possibility that we kind of negotiate separately with them, right? Their economies
where's
are so
his head
different.
at right now?
Our relationship with the Canadian economy is totally different than our relationship with the Mexican economy, right? I mean, the labor situation is different. The stuff that's being made is different. The export and import profile is different. It actually doesn't make a ton of economic sense why we would marry those three together. I mean, the actual trade between Canada and Mexico is much smaller than the trade between the U.S. and Canada and U.S. and Mexico. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, you know, USMCA, it's a $31 trillion agreement. It's like, well, yeah, but like 29 trillion is us. So, I mean, I think it makes sense to talk to them separately about that agreement. A lot of the underlying rules, I think, are helpful, and our exporters benefit from them, but we have to make sure that we are getting the benefit of our bargain on USMCA.
You were in Brussels recently talking deals. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said when he was over there that the U.S. could modify its approach on steel and aluminum tariffs if the EU reconsidered its digital rules. Some European officials were a little irked by that and interpreted it as targeting the EU's flagship tech regulations, including the Digital Markets Act. Europe's antitrust chief, Teresa Ribera, told Politico that Washington is, quote, using blackmail to strong-arm the EU. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, that's just a totally extreme thing to say. The problem is the Digital Markets Act and other European digital regulations and regulations outside of digital, they actually target U.S. companies. And how do we know that? First of all, when all these laws were being passed, all of the European parliamentarians and all the leaders in Europe were saying, we're going to implement these laws to get Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. They have certain taxes over there, and they call them GAFA tax. And they the acronym is for American companies. And then they have these thresholds built into these laws where if you meet a certain global revenue threshold or you have a certain business model, and just magically they only capture U.S. companies. When I was there in Brussels, I was complaining about this issue. And one of the officials said, well, no, this is a fair and non-discriminatory law. And I said, well, have you ever investigated a non-U.S. company under the law? And they just kept talking. I said, no, wait, have you ever done it? And they said, well, just one, TikTok, right? I mean, dozens of cases against U.S. companies and then TikTok. So the law in its intent is discriminatory, and de facto it's discriminatory. And listen, the Europeans, they love to regulate. They don't really innovate, but they do regulate. They're just not going to regulate our guys and their global business models, right? If anyone's going to regulate them, we are.
We reported last month that the European Commission was set to present a list to you guys of sectors that it wants to be exempted from U.S. tariffs. The list was expected to include medical devices, wine, which is very important to me, spirits, beers, and pasta. Where do those deliberations stand?
Well, they did not present such a list.
Ah.
And the reason why is because under our deal from the summer, the United States has already adjusted its tariff levels for Europe, and Europe is still adjusting its tariffs, right? I don't say this to be critical. They have a legal process they have to go through, and they're proceeding through it as quickly as they can, I think. So it would be weird for them to come and say, we haven't finished making our tariff adjustments yet, and we want more from you. Listen, if they want to come and talk about other tariff adjustments, that'll be up to the president and that kind of thing. But it's a sequencing issue. Why would I give them more tariff relief before they've done their part of the bargain, right? That doesn't make sense.
I am curious because so much of what you guys are doing is unprecedented. And I think in part, Trump talked about tariffs on the campaign trail, but I don't think a lot of the world, particularly our allies in Europe, were necessarily prepared for the scale, as you mentioned earlier. When you were in Brussels, for example, can you give me a little bit of a behind the scenes on what those conversations are like when you sit across the table?
Sure. So remember, we're now then it was November, 11 months into this presidency.
Yeah.
And so I would say that most of our European partners have frankly become quite pragmatic. In the first term, when we talked about tariffs and changing the global structure, there was a lot of almost religious sounding sermonizing from the Europeans, right? For them, international institutions and what they believe is international law, this is like religion, right? It's their religion, and they have these high priests of the religion in the European Commission, all these places. But the folks we're dealing with right now in the European Commission, President von der Leyen, the Trade Commissioner, these are pragmatic folks. They understand the facts on the ground. They understand the U.S. view. They understand we have these huge trade deficits that are not sustainable. And so the conversations are constructive. We're not fighting about policy. We're talking about implementation. So that's all positive. All that being said, there are 2 or 3 countries that still like to sermonize a little bit about this. The ambassador from one country came to me and said, well, how can you use these tariffs against us? Tariffs are bad, blah, blah, blah. And I said, if tariffs are so bad, then how come your tariffs on us are so high still? And he said, well, I'm not trying to negotiate, but I mean, that's my point. They come and they say, well, you shouldn't have tariffs, but European tariffs have been higher on the U.S. historically for many years.
You said the conversations are productive and pragmatic now. Is that a shift from early this year?
Yes, 100%.
What was the initial sort of reaction as you were trying to explain what you guys are doing?
Well, it's not personal, right? In 2024, we had a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods. That is not sustainable. That is an expression of an economy that has been running on government funding, financed consumption, offshoring of production overseas, and importing the product of other workers, of foreign workers. That is not sustainable. If you actually believe in economics, right, all these people who complain about tariffs and supply and demand, those imbalances are not supposed to exist. You're not supposed to have a giant trade deficit. Currencies are supposed to adjust and that kind of thing. Overcapacity is supposed to shut down. None of that is adjusting how it is supposed to. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But a lot of the first few months of this administration, we were explaining that to the Europeans and others that, hey, we're trying to eliminate this deficit and reindustrialize here in America. And do you support America's reindustrialization or do you not? And when you ask them in those terms, they say, well, we understand the imbalances. You're right. They shouldn't exist. We understand you want to reindustrialize. That's a fair thing. And we understand that you're imposing a tariff on us. So those are the facts on the ground. People become quite pragmatic when you have that kind of leverage.
So where does the EU deal stand?
We had our joint statement in August. We've adjusted our tariffs to be a little bit lower for them. They're in the process of adjusting theirs. We have a lot of non-tariff barriers that we face in Europe, regulatory constraints, certifications, inspection regimes, things that are duplicative, things that gum up trade between the United States and Europe.
Did Brussels move that all forward, do you think?
I would say so, right? It was less of a negotiating trip and more of a taking stock of where we are, where we're divergent, and next steps. So we have a small team coming over from the Europeans next week to really talk about how do we better memorialize changes in these non-tariff barriers going forward. Because even though the Europeans are taking down most of their tariffs for us, if you take down the tariff, but there's still non-tariff barriers, it's not effective market access. So we have to do both, the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers.
I don't think we can talk trade without talking about China. What is the administration's end game with China? Is it coexistence? Is it decoupling? Is it selective engagement? Like, what is it?
Well, it's funny. Washington creates these kind of fake categories, right? They'll say like, oh, well, either you're a China hawk or a China dove. The way we think about it in the administration is we're pro-American. We're not anti-China. We're not China doves. We're not China hawks. We are pro-American.
I think you meant to say America first, but you know.
Well, yeah. Yes, America first. Thank you. Sometimes you hear people saying, well, for America to win, China has to lose. I just don't think that's the case. I mean, the reality is we are going to do what's right for America in terms of trade. And in some cases, it means we have to have a tariff on countries, higher tariffs on some, like China, because they're a bigger issue with respect to trade, right? They have more trade cheating, they have more subsidies and that kind of thing. If China still manages to be successful, fine, right? We're not here to try to contain China. We're here to make sure that America has a strong national security, strong economic security, that our workers have jobs that are good for them in the towns and cities where they live, that they can raise a family. That's what we're trying to do, right? China rises or falls on that. That's kind of up to them. We're happy to work with them. They have their own plans. One thing I will say is people act like American policy drives Chinese reaction, that China's just always reacting to us. And I think they want us to think that, but they're agents unto themselves. They publish a new policy every 5 years. They have 5-year plans. They announced this Made in China 2025 project in 2015, well before President Trump was the president. So they have their own economic plans, which are oftentimes averse to our interests, and so we will control for that, whether through tariffs or other measures. It's not about being anti-China. It's about being America first.
We just traveled the world for a little bit here, but ultimately all of this stuff that you're doing across the globe is about America, right? So for consumers, for voters who we just saw in this last election in November, clearly sent a message that affordability, cost of living, that stuff really, really matters. What can you tell American people about what they can expect to see going into next year? How will all of this impact their day-to-day? Not the markets,
Sure.
but their day-to-day.
So first of all, what I would say is trade, it's not a big factor in the affordability discussion, right? When you look at affordability, it's really about crazy high expenses for healthcare, right, that were engendered by Obamacare, which was a disaster. It's about housing expenses that went way up during the Biden years and are still
But I think some
working to
people, as
bring
they're
down.
shopping for Christmas, are connecting prices at Walmart and at the grocery store to the affordability conversation.
Yeah, I've talked to Walmart officials. I've talked to all kinds of officials, and they have said that they're not raising prices, right? At back to school time in September, say we're not raising prices. They're still doing their rollbacks. I know that's a press narrative, but it's actually not a true narrative. When you talk about affordability,
Well,
people
that's why I
people
ask,
are worried
like,
about
yeah.
housing. They're worried about healthcare, things we don't import.
Yeah.
Where trade comes into it is when you have a trade system in place that protects U.S. jobs, you get higher incomes. Okay, so the blue collar wages are up this year. That's what matters, right? In the first term, we had real income increase, right, up until the pandemic, which is like this black swan event. That's what we're trying to do with trade, right? Trade is not let's manage affordability through trade. Trade is let's make sure we have good paying jobs here, especially for that working class whose jobs went away to Mexico or Vietnam or China. And so if you have blue collar wages going up, whatever price effects are going on from all kinds of things in the economy, as long as the real income is outpacing whatever price effects there are, that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're seeing.
So what will Americans experience in the next year or the rest of the Trump administration as a result of these trade policies?
The most important thing you'll see is a lot of the investment that's been announced this year, new foreign investment, greenfield investment, and all these plants you're hearing about, whether it's AI data centers that are going up, new pharmaceutical plants, new auto construction lines, semiconductor plants being built in Arizona and New York and all over. Those are the advanced manufacturing jobs I was talking about, and those pay higher than a lot of the basic services jobs that people have right now. And those are the jobs that are going to bring people out of their mom's basement where they're playing video games or something. So that's the benefit of trade, is we are able to protect American manufacturing, and manufacturing jobs pay higher on average than a services job in the United States. So that's where they're going to see the benefit next year as the factories go up, as the big, beautiful bill tax incentives go into effect, the expensing happens. That's where you're going to see a lot of the growth is in better jobs that are better paying for those lowest 2 quintiles of the economy.
What about those tariff dividends that the president has floated?
Yeah, well, you can talk to Scott Besson. I don't control the money. I just put the tariffs on to make the deals.
Why should Americans care about a trade deficit?
Because it represents jobs that they could have had. If you're a multinational company, you don't care about a trade deficit. You just care that you're making money. Whether you make the product in Malaysia or Brazil and sell to the United States, you don't care. You're just worried about your bottom line. That's capitalism. That's okay. But if you are a welder or you're an auto worker in Ohio, you care about the trade deficit because those are cars that are being made in Monterrey, Mexico, that could have been made in Toledo or Cleveland or something like that. That's the issue. It doesn't matter if you're a company, but it does matter if you're an American worker.
So why do you think they were left at status quo for so long?
A lot of it is our system, right? I mean, the president is not beholden to anybody. And for a long time, we have had politicians, including politicians in charge, who were very much captured by corporate interests, I think. The president isn't beholden to anybody. He can be populist, right? He can stand up for the workers who don't have their own voice. And by the way, there's also a lot of inertia. You had the end of the Cold War, you had the Berlin Wall come down. And then in 1994, what did you have? You have the World Trade Organization, you had NAFTA. The whole idea was to lower U.S. tariffs and import more. What does that mean? It means that we buy more from overseas versus domestic production. And that took hold. President Clinton liked that. W. Bush liked it. Obama liked it. But by the time Clinton and Trump were running for president in 2015 and 2016, they were both running against free trade.
I want to ask before I let you go, you talked very passionately about this stuff throughout this interview. What made you, Jamieson Greer, a trade and tariff guy?
So I actually started my career as an attorney in the U.S. Air Force. I was a JAG, deployed to Iraq, did all of that. Very interested in public service. And then when I got out, because I wanted just a little more stability, I didn't want to move around all the time with my family. I wanted to have a legal career that had an element of service to the country. And I went to interview for a job, and I found out that I could have a job in international trade. I was in the private sector representing U.S. manufacturers who were dealing with unfairly traded imports from China and other countries. We were conducting litigation that saved U.S. manufacturing jobs. And to me, that was public service because you can't make tanks and missiles unless you have steel and aluminum and all these different kinds of things. It was nice to be able to have a private sector job that also had a sense of mission. And it dovetailed nicely with my sense of public service and what I think our country needs. And anyway, here I am. The rest is history.
You are on the world stage making deals.
Right.
Jamieson Greer,
right.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation.
You.
This has been The Conversation with Dasha Burns. And if you want to catch future episodes of The Conversation, be sure to click that subscribe button below. Thanks for watching.